John, this is Ralph speaking.
Hi, Ralph.
I'm very interested in this talk. This is exactly in my street.
Yeah.
Because wouldn't it be the case that the whole economic and monetary considerations are far more important than the, let's say, the cultural ones? My impression is that the conservatives indeed project all their ideas and all their ideals on the current Russia world, thinking that Russia would never do any lockdowns, it would be against wokeism, it doesn't believe in climate change, and all that I think is only partly true. We seem to idealize that and think that that's the perfect world where all our ideas are being entertained, but my impression is that it's far more a currency war where indeed Russia, together with a whole number of other states, is trying to crush the primary position of the United States in the international economic order, rather than taking over a completely different cultural direction. What's your thought on that?
I totally agree with you, Ralph. I've never idealized Russia. Russia did not. It's true that the lockdowns, I believe that they were slightly less fierce than they were in Europe, and above all, perhaps not as well respected. But yes, they did have lockdowns, and yes, they did have vaccines, albeit not mRNA vaccines. So I've never. And what was the other thing you mentioned? On
anti-wokeism, anti-climate change.
Yes, well, actually, they're not anti-climate change. I mean, Putin attended the COP26 summit in Paris some years ago. So, on the face of it, they've signed up. I can't remember. Perhaps they didn't go to the latest Glasgow one, but they're not. The Russians are not ideologically on our side on climate change, so I don't idealize them. On wokeism and things, yes, I think they are closer to our position than many other countries, so we can be happy about that. But it's not a matter of idealizing them. It's a matter instead, or certainly from my point of view, of having a critical view of what the Americans do and what the Europeans do. And I totally agree with you that there is a currency war going on. The de-dollarization thing is absolutely fundamental. If, as I said just now, if people stop needing to use the dollar because they can use their own currencies for bilateral trade, then a very major pillar of American hegemony and indeed American prosperity will disappear. And in addition to the things I've mentioned, so for instance, using yuan to pay for, Russian gas or whatever, rather than going through the dollar, there are, of course, projects within the BRICS alliance to create some kind of common currency for the BRICS alliance, some kind of basket of currencies or whatever. And all these initiatives are designed to take away the preeminent role of the dollar. There are occasional suggestions that there might even be some link between the ruble and gold, which, from my personal point of view, would be the absolute ideal solution. But all these things have as their goal, indeed, to take away the hegemony of the dollar, and I think that is one of the most important things to look for, in addition to the military side.
Right, because the feeling I have is that there's quite a lot of let's say, resentment against the US because of their military adventurism, so to speak, across the world, and their bases all over the place, and their play as the global policeman bully. That is not very well accepted in the world. So there's a lot of commonality in the criticism against the actual behavior of the United States internationally. But as an alternative to their cultural imperialism, what they in fact have established, the new group is a bit of a silly bunch, isn't it? I mean, it's ranges from Saudi Arabia to Iran to China to Brazil. I mean, it's difficult to find a common cultural element in that.
Yes, but the whole point about the new development is that certainly what they say, what the Chinese and the Russians say and have been saying, is that they want a multipolar world. So they're not, to be fair to them, proposing to come up with one new cultural model for the whole world. Instead, what they want is a multipolar world, both in the geopolitical sense, in other words, with various power centers, not just one power center, and perhaps also in the cultural sense. So the fact that they don't have one single cultural model, I don't think is incompatible with their overall goal, on the contrary. But since you mentioned the cultural side, I think many people, I'm sure, would agree that obviously the American, very broadly speaking, cultural model has greatly weakened. Now, as you've yourself said, Ralph, all the military adventurism has backfired massively. Everybody, 20 years on, still remembers the Iraq War. People remember it with great bitterness. And that war and the other wars, and as you say, all the bases and so on, have severely damaged, I think, America's reputation. If you think back to the 50s, so the immediate post-war period, the difference could hardly be greater. Americans were liberators, the GIs were nice guys, you had Westerns, you had John Wayne, you had, everything was sort of upbeat and rather charming. And obviously America was very rich and the dollar was all powerful and so on. If you compare that overall mood music now to what I would say most people around the world, and I'm thinking, of course, of people in Eastern Europe, obviously Africa, Asia, and so on, what they see now is a much more cynical and brutal United States of America, plus all the wokeism, which, although you're right to say, Ralph, yes, between India and Iran or whatever, there's not much in common, or Saudi Arabia or whatever, and Russia. The fact is that the whole LGBT propaganda, the whole gay marriage thing, the whole all those faddish sexual developments that we know of in America and in Europe, they go down very badly, I would say, all over the whole of the continent of Africa. They probably go down badly in most of Asia. They go down badly, obviously, in the Middle East, in the Muslim world, and so on. So you have vast swathes of the planet that are alienated by these latest developments in the West. And it doesn't need one single alternative model, cultural model, for people to realize that they don't want that anymore and instead move to, as I say, a more diverse, if we can use that word for once positively, a more diverse cultural and multipolar world.
Yes, I agree, but at the same time, I think that there's a bit of a gap then, because indeed, I think there's a strong feeling against a number of these extreme parts of the cultural imperialism of the United States today, which is indeed the wokeness part and the out of control consumerism and all that sort of thing. But let's say that the counter move against that doesn't really offer an alternative other than diversity in all sorts of directions. I think it's a bit empty now. There's a broad understanding that what America has to offer has had its best time, so to speak, and it's perhaps time for something else. But this something else is not very articulated. It's a bit
Well, Russia, Putin has articulated the woke side, the anti-woke side, fairly clearly. He has said that proposing, sex change operations to children is Satanism. That's pretty clear.
Yeah. The anti part is clear, but the pro part is not that clear.
No, I don't know. He's talked, there's a famous speech of his in, I think, 2013 at the Valdai Group where he talked about traditional values. I agree. I think the whole sort of cultural dominance of America in the 1950s and perhaps even in the 60s is perhaps a hard act to follow. So maybe you're right that there isn't anything quite that powerful, quite that attractive. Once again, Russia alone, perhaps unlike America, cannot pretend to lead the whole world. Russia tried with the the Soviet experiment. And I think my view is that Russia learned a lot. I mean, obviously it was very damaging, the Soviet experiment, and it set Russia back by a generation. But I think it also taught the Russian elites quite a lot, and in particular, I think it taught them the folly, really, from the point of view of national interest, of trying to lead the world. That's obviously what the Soviet Union did during the communist period. It was obviously the leading communist state, and it tried to present itself as the bearer of a model potentially for the entire world. And of course that ended up in great failure, and it ended up being very costly to the Russian state, to the Soviet state itself. So in some ways I think that I would be surprised if Russia thought that it could propose one model for the whole world anymore. I think it has its own model which it intends to defend, and it's very happy if other people support it. But I don't get the impression that the Russians want to repeat, the current Russian regime wants to repeat the Soviet experience, where it becomes where it pretends to be a beacon for the whole planet. On the contrary, I think that Russia knows that it can only hope to row back or push back on the American hegemony in alliance with other countries, and in particular with China.
Do you have a view of what alternative structure, what alternative world order, so to speak, or disorder perhaps, is there in the minds of Xi and Putin? How do they think things should be developing? 15 different nodes in a network, or?
Well, I do actually, yes. I mean, I think when you listen to certainly Russian leaders, Putin and so on, or Lavrov, and as far as I know, when you listen to Xi Jinping, or for that matter, to people like Erdogan in Turkey, or let me think, even the Saudis, all these people speak the language of practical cooperation. The Russians are obsessed with the idea of cooperation. It's one of their favorite words. They're always going on about cooperation. And these countries like the idea of, a bit like with Trump, the art of the deal. They like to sit around a table and hammer out a deal that is beneficial to both sides without ideological prejudice. And I think the model they propose is indeed multinodal, yes, multilateral, so number of bilateral or trilateral arrangements. If you look at the way that Turkey has behaved in the last 5 or 10 years. Let me think, it's about 8 years ago or so, maybe 10 years ago, that Turkey shot down a Russian fighter plane. And then the Russian ambassador in Turkey was murdered in Ankara. You had there the elements which could have triggered some kind of very major crisis. And of course, Russia and Turkey were on opposite sides in both Syria and in Libya. So you had all the elements of a very serious rift between Russia and Turkey building up. And yet, for other reasons, including because of their situation with NATO and also, by the way, for geographical reasons, Erdogan and Putin managed to put aside these potential areas of conflict, including the very serious one of Syria, and instead work out some kind of modus vivendi. And I think that model is something that the West, with its extremely ideological approach to politics, has forgotten about.
It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, it's a complete upside-down situation,
yes,
compared to 40 years ago.
Exactly. So whereas, the tradition of diplomacy is that, yes, you don't agree with the other side, yes, you don't share the same ideological system or value system or whatever, but you can still, if you try, come to some kind of modus vivendi. That has completely vanished. Instead, the West now is a purely ideological construct. The NATO documents are dripping with ideology. They're all about values and human rights and democracy and so on. And I mean, it's all very hypocritical, of course, because NATO is perfectly capable of getting on with countries that don't share those values when it suits it. But the discourse is deeply, deeply ideological. And indeed, the practice is becoming increasingly ideological as well.
It requires a detoxification of all involved to be fully aware of that, because it's let's say the narrative in the West is still that we are not ideological. The other side is we are simply going for the common sense direction, which is democracy, human rights, women's lib, etc. And the reality is indeed the other way around. What's the whole concept of our way of looking is highly ideological, whereas the other side is simply looking for deals. But that's almost unfathomable, I think, for someone who has been looking at international politics for tens of years, because it's a complete 180-degree change compared to a number of years ago.
It certainly is, and I mentioned, unlikely alliances, but we had the absolutely incredible prospect, I think it was last week, of China brokering an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Yes, great.
And this is, absolutely incredible. Firstly, the fact that Saudi Arabia and Iran are now talking to each other. The two major enemies on either sides of the Persian Gulf. The fact that they're now talking to each other, and the fact that this deal was brokered by China. I mean, these are really massive geopolitical developments. The Americans were nowhere to be seen, obviously, because they have not been speaking to the Iranians for 40 years. So yes, we are seeing initiative escaping their clasp. And instead, countries which, for all kinds of reasons absolutely hate each other, which is obviously the case with the Saudis and the Iranians, deciding that actually it's better to, as far as one can, put aside one's ideological differences and simply try to work together. So that's an example. Another example is like the one I gave of Turkey and Russia. The Saudi-Iranian example, Saudi Arabia-Iranian example is an absolutely incredible development.
But now, as I understand it, Turkey seems to be bullied in position as to the membership of Finland of NATO, don't you think?
Yes, Turkey has agreed to do that, and I'm personally, I'm personally not happy about that. But on the other hand, I suppose Erdogan is playing a double game. I mean, I suppose he doesn't want to, put himself entirely at odds with his own, at least on paper, allies. So yeah, I mean, I think the admission of Finland is a mistake, but there we are. Maybe he felt he couldn't fight. He had to choose his battles or something like that.
Yes, and the last man standing is Hungary, I think. Or has Hungary already...
No, I think Hungary is still to ratify, but I don't anticipate Hungary preventing it. So I suppose that will go ahead. Yeah, and I mean, okay, I'm not particularly happy with it. I don't see what help it will bring. But I don't know. I can't explain to you why Erdogan did that. I suspect that he, as I say, he's simply trying to choose his battles.
Yes. No, we just stated yesterday, I did, that we would love to leave NATO.
Yes.
Which left all my let's say the other politicians in the room a bit baffled.
Yes.
That's a position that no one has taken in the last 25 years.
No, I know. Yeah, well, it's a very good thing. I'm very glad you did that, because NATO is a source of great instability and produces all kinds of perverse effects. It of course tends to magnify and draw people into conflicts which otherwise they may not, they may decide not to take part in. So I'm very glad you said that. Well done.
The parallels with the mafia, where you pay protection money, are striking, don't you think?
Yes, I mean, this is a parallel I've made myself, including on television. That's, by the way, the only explanation I can give. People have said, well, why don't the Germans and the other Europeans say anything about the Nord Stream gas pipelines? You'd think that this was a fatal blow to the Atlantic Alliance and so on. And the only answer I can come up with, the only rational answer I can come up with, is that they are afraid, and that they think that if they protest against what the Americans did by blowing up the pipelines, that the next act of sabotage will be even worse. I think that
you might get an earthquake.
Exactly, you might get an earthquake. Exactly, there's that theory, yeah. But I mean, indeed, I think that the relationship between the Americans and the Europeans is indeed between a mafia boss and the people from whom he extracts protection money. That is, I do believe that is the relationship, because there's no other explanation for the unbelievable humiliation that has been heaped on, particularly on Germany, in this whole business, both by the United States and, of course, by Poland.
Yes.
I think maybe with the time we have left, like 10 minutes, we also want to give some people in our audience the opportunity to talk or ask John some questions. So I would ask everybody here in the space, do you have something from John? You can send us a request, and then we come to you as soon as possible. But in the meantime, you two can talk. No problem.
Where did you make this? Where did you make
worried that I hijacked the discussion? So I'll leave it to you, John.